A few days ago, the Orthodox Muslim published a video called Proving Islam in 7 Minutes, where he claimed a hadith prophesying the siege of Baghdad proves Muhammad was a true prophet. And to support his argument, he used this diagram. I recognize this diagram because I made it for an article called Fabricated Hadith Prophecy, the Siege of Baghdad. Now, if he had read that article, he would have realized this diagram actually proves the exact opposite of what he claims, that the hadith is not reliable. But here's what's more troubling. He didn't just misunderstand the diagram. He deliberately misrepresented it. This wasn't some accident or misunderstanding. This was a deliberate deception. He accessed the source, used its research, but reversed its conclusion to tell his audience the exact opposite of what the actual evidence shows. He even crossed out the textual criticisms of the metin from the original diagram so that he could falsely claim that they're all consistent.
And I mentioned this already. All these reports have a consistent metin, meaning no single later narrator after Sa'id ibn Juhman adds or takes away from the significant details found in the report. Rather, across all the witnesses, the metin, the information, the content stays consistent.
This Orthodox Muslim situation demonstrates a problem that Hadith scholars identified over a millennium ago. Yahya ibn Sa'id, a prominent Basran Hadith critic, stated, "You will not see the people of good more false in anything than they are regarding Hadith." A 2nd century Hadith scholar, someone who dedicated his life in trying to weed out the fabrications in Hadith, admitted that well-intentioned believers were often the worst offenders when it came to Hadith fabrication. In classical Hadith criticism, a transmitter who knowingly misrepresents information from a source would be deemed unreliable at best and a fabricator at worst. The Orthodox Muslim represents exactly what Yahya warned about, people claiming to be people of good, but pushing out falsehood when it comes to Hadith, just like the Hadith transmitters of the past. Now let me show you what the evidence actually demonstrates. He claims Muhammad predicted a city called Basra on the Tigris River with a bridge. It would become a major Muslim capital. The descendants of Kantura with broad faces and small eyes would attack it, and the people would split into 3 groups with a specific outcome. He argues this was fulfilled when the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258. And his evidence? Multiple Hadith compilations with similar chains. And through the use of Ikma, he claims we can trace it to the 1st century. There are fatal flaws in every part of this argument, and the diagram he uses actually exposes them. Look carefully. Every single chain converges at one person, Sa'id. This is called the common link, where a certain narrator pretty much proliferates the narration.
No single compiler could have possibly made this up, as is corroborated by the 2 other compilers and vice versa. And if we move on to the next set of transmitters, no single transmitter could have made this up, as he's corroborated by 4 other transmitters.
His argument is pretty simple. It's multiple books, means multiple sources, which means we can trace it back to its alleged origin. But that's not how it works. All those witnesses are downstream from Sa'id. Imagine I tell you a story, you tell 3 friends, and they tell more people. Eventually, 10 books record that statement. Do these 10 books prove my story is true? No. They prove it spread. It's still one source, me. Sa'id tells this story, and his students spread it, and multiple scholars write it down, but it traces back to one person, Sa'id. Christians make this exact argument. Paul says Jesus appeared to the 12 disciples, John taught Polycarp, Irenaeus knew Polycarp, and multiple later books quote Irenaeus. It's the same pattern. One key transmitter upstream, many repeaters downstream, and multiple books essentially copy one source, which is the common link.
Sa'id ibn Juhman was active and narrating in Kufa in the 1st century, and he dies in the early 2nd century. So we know that at the very least, using the Isnad meta-analysis, that this narration, this report, goes back to this individual, active in the 1st century. In the 1st century, this is attributed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Here's the problem. The earliest versions don't come from the Prophet at all. Actually, the 1st century, the chain goes back to Rabi'a ibn Jawshan, who said,
I came to Al-Sham and entered upon Abdullah ibn Amr.
Where are you from?
We are from the people of Basra.
Then prepare yourselves, O people of Basra.
For what should we prepare?
For provisions and water skins. The best wealth today is camels, upon which a man can carry his family and provide for them, and a strong, enduring horse. By God, soon the sons of Kantura will drive you out from there until they place you in Daqiyya.
And who are the sons of Kantura?
As for in the book, that is how we find it. And as for the description, they are the Turks.
Abdullah ibn Amr's own statement doesn't cite the Prophet. There's no prophetic chain, no Qala Rasulullah. He explicitly tells us his source, which is the book, Al-Kitab. He's not talking about the Quran here. He's talking about biblical sources. And here's the specific biblical connection he's drawing from. In Genesis 25, verses 1 through 4, Abraham takes a wife named Keturah. She bears him 6 sons, and the text says Abraham sent them away to the east country. And later Islamic scholars explicitly make this identification. We have Al-Qurtubi who says,
Banu Kantura, the descendants of Kantura, are the Turks. It is said that Kantura was a slave girl who belonged to Abraham, and she bore him sons from whose lineage are the Turks.
This is the biblical source Abdullah ibn Amr was using. Abraham's wife, Keturah, sent east, became associated with Eastern people, which were considered the Turks. Now, who was Abdullah ibn Amr? He was a companion famous for collecting Jewish and Christian stories. There's even hadith where he states the Prophet allegedly said,
Tell others the stories of Bani Israel, which have been taught to you, for it is not sinful to do so.
And so of course he did. He never said that this hadith of Banu Kantura was from the Prophet, which means he got it from these biblical sources. So what do we actually have from the 1st century? Abdullah ibn Amr makes a prediction about Basra. He attributes it to the book, which we know is biblical sources. He identifies these attackers as Turks, not Mongols. Scholars like Ibn Sirin record this as Abdullah's statement, not the Prophet. We don't have a prophetic chain to the Prophet, and we don't have a claim that this is revelation. This is Abdullah ibn Amr's apocalyptic speculation based from Jewish and Christian literature. According to the Hadith, it's fine. This is what the 1st century sources actually show. Now let's jump forward about 30 to 40 years to Sa'id's time. Sa'id lived through the Khawarij attacks on Basra, militant splinters who raided the city targeting so-called apostates. Sa'id himself was living in Basra during these attacks and experienced the chaos firsthand. Now that you understand his living situation, watch what happens to Sa'id's version of this hadith. Sa'id narrates from a son of Abu Bakr, from the Prophet, people from my nation will settle in a land called Basra, by a river called the Tigris. It will have a bridge, its people will multiply, and it will become one of the cities of the Muslims. In the end times, the Banu Kantura, with broad faces and small eyes, will come and camp by the riverbank. The people will divide into 3 groups. One will flee to the desert and perish, one will seek safety for themselves and commit disbelief, and one will put their families behind them, fight, and become martyrs. Already off the bat, you notice that Abdullah's version is different than Sa'id's version. And this is a textbook hadith fabrication evolution. A vague prediction exists from a companion. Decades pass, a crisis occurs, someone elevates it to prophetic status and adds vivid details that match their environment, and the embellished version spreads with higher authority. We can pinpoint exactly where this transformation happened, and it was at the time of Sa'id. Even classical hadith authorities raised red flags about Sa'id. This is exactly why Ahmad's versions of this hadith are graded as weak by Arnaut, even within the traditional Islamic framework of hadith criticism. But let's not just take their word for it. Let's look at what Sa'id actually does with this specific hadith. Sa'id claims he got this hadith from a son of Abu Bakr, but he can't keep straight with which son he actually got it from. Look at the variations. In some version he says, Muslim ibn Abi Bakr. In other versions he says just Ibn Abi Bakr, which is the son of Abu Bakr, without specifying which son. In yet another version he says Abdullah ibn Abi Bakr. 3 different identifications of his immediate source. Now according to Imam Dahabi, Abu Bakr had 4 sons who narrated from him: Ubaydullah, Abdurrahman, Abdulaziz, and Muslim. These are distinct individuals. And here's what makes this even more damaging. We actually know from the earlier version, the one preserved by Abdur Razzaq, that it was Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr who originally reported Abdullah ibn Amr's statement. So the original chain goes through Abdurrahman, but Sa'id's version, decades later, can't consistently identify whether he heard it from Muslim, Abdullah, or just leave it vague as the son of Abu Bakr. This isn't a minor detail. In hadith criticism, precise identification of your immediate teacher is foundational. If you can't remember who told you the report, how can we trust that you remember what they actually said? Sa'id is adding prophetic attribution, adding vivid details, adding theological interpretations, and he can't even keep straight with which son supposedly told him all of this. And notice something else about this chain. Abu Bakr is from Basra, his sons are from Basra, Sa'id is from Basra, and the hadith is about Basra. The entire chain that goes up to Sa'id is Basran, talking about Basra during a time when Basra is under attack. If you're going to fabricate a prophecy to comfort your city during a crisis, you naturally use local authorities to give it credibility. Why would you cite Medina narrators for something specifically about Basra? You wouldn't. This is a Basran production from Basran sources for a Basran audience addressing a Basran crisis.
And it has and finds its fulfillment 500 to 600 years later at the siege of Baghdad. The siege of Baghdad marks the end of the Islamic Golden Age, when the Mongols, who are an Asian people with broad faces and small eyes, they descend, they attack the Muslims in a city called Baghdad. They attack the city in the area called Babul Basra. The city was huge and was known by different bureaus. The fulfillment happens exactly as the Prophet mentions, exactly as the different reports mention.
Now let's be clear about the geography of the city. This is Basra, southern Iraq. This is Baghdad, central Iraq. 340 miles apart, or 550 kilometers. The hadith says some people will settle in low-lying land called Al-Basra by a river known as the Tigris. It says Al-Basra, not Baghdad. The hadith explicitly names the city, and the hadith describes low-lying land. Basra is low-lying land, but Baghdad is not. This describes Basra's geography perfectly. If God wanted to specify a prophecy for the prophet for proof of his prophethood and wanted the prediction to be of the Mongol invasion of Baghdad, why say Basra, a city that already exists, that was known, a completely different city 340 miles away? If this was about Baghdad, early Muslims should interpret it that way, but they don't. In the 9th century, Ibn al-Munadi wrote about the Zanj rebellion and applied this hadith to the Zanj attack on Basra, not Baghdad, not the Mongols. Why did a scholar 300 years closer to the Prophet think it was about Basra specifically? It's because the hadith itself says Basra. Now, he's confident this predicts the Mongols, but Muslims throughout history have applied this hadith to completely different groups. In the 9th century, as mentioned before, Ibn al-Munadi applied this to the Zanj rebellion. In the 10th century, Turkic slave soldiers caused problems. Banu Kantura was applied to Turks. And finally later, when the Baghdad situation occurred, the interpretation shifted to Mongols. Do you see the pattern? Every generation takes this vague hadith description and applies it to their current enemy. Banu Kantura used to be the Zanj, and then it was the Turks, and then it became the Mongols. Broad faces and small eyes became a generic description for anybody they wanted to apply it to that had broad faces and small eyes. And the location was reinterpreted for the current crisis. And look at the classical scholar's own interpretation. If we look at the hadith that Sa'id is transmitting, in the hadith itself, Al-Awam is saying Banu Kantura are the Turks. He's saying this in the hadith. Qurtubi says they're the Turks, not Mongols, Turks. Even the transmitters from Sa'id himself explicitly state that these guys are Turks, not Mongols. The hadith explicitly identifies the attackers as Turks. The scholars who transmitted it said they were Turks. The companion who originated the statement said they were Turks based on biblical genealogy. But modern apologists living after 1258 retroactively apply it to Mongols and claim it's a fulfilled prophecy. This is just reading your desired conclusion into the text.
What's interesting, and I mentioned this already, all these reports have a consistent matan, meaning no single later narrator after Sa'id ibn Juhman adds or takes away from the significant details found in the report. Rather, across all the witnesses, the matan, the information, the content stays consistent, and we can date this back to the very least to the 1st century.
Now, this statement is just not true. The matan isn't consistent at all. We actually find major variations between the versions. First, the city name. Ahmed 20451 says Al-Busayra. Ahmed 20414 shows doubt because it says Al-Basra or Al-Busayra. Abu Dawood 4306 just says Basra. Now the bridge detail. Some narrations say a camp on a bridge called Dijla. Others say at the Dijla River with a bridge. And some don't even mention the bridge at all. Then the animals. One says tails of camels. Another says tails of cattle. There's even a physical description change between the hadith variations. Some have broad faces and small eyes. Others only say broad-faced people with no mention of small eyes. These aren't minor word differences because they're contradictions in core details. Different city, setting, animals, and physical features. So the claim of there's a consistent matan isn't true. So we've established all the chains go back to Sa'id. The earliest versions aren't prophetic. It says Basra, not Baghdad. It says Turks, not Mongols. But I want you to see how this actually evolved. 3 stages, so watch closely. In the 1st century, Abdullah ibn Amr, a companion famous for collecting Jewish and Christian stories, tells some people from Basra that Banu Kantura will come from Iraq. They ask who that is, and he says, in the book, that's how we find it. They're the Turks. He's quoting Genesis, Abraham's wife Keturah, whose sons went east. That's it, vague, biblical, about Turks threatening Iraq, not a prophecy from Muhammad. Then stage 2. 40 years later, Sa'id, living in Basra, experienced the Kharijite attacks on his city. His father was murdered by them. The city's under siege from the east bank of the Tigris by the bridge. Now suddenly, Sa'id narrates this as a hadith from the Prophet, with all those specific details. Basra by the Tigris with a bridge. Invaders camp by the river. 3 groups. One flees, one commits apostasy, and one become martyrs. Every detail matches the Kharijite attack he just lived through. It's not prediction, it's just his trauma being repackaged as a prophetic hadith. Then, 600 years later, Mongols destroy Baghdad. Scholars want to find prophecies about it, but the problem is that the hadith says Basra. It says Turks. Baghdad is 340 miles away, and Mongols are not Turks. So the solution is just reinterpret everything. Now, instead of saying Basra the city, they say Basra the entire region and include Baghdad. Turks means Mongols now. But 9th century scholars applied this same hadith to the Zenj rebellion in Basra. 10th century scholars applied it to Turkish slave soldiers, and further generations just bend this to fit their crisis. The point being that the original narration was based on the Bible. Sa'id reinterpreted it to fit his scenario, his crisis in Basra. And now people are using that hadith to say it's about Baghdad, even though the hadith has nothing to do with the situation in Baghdad and has nothing to do with Mongol. And that's exactly what the Orthodox Muslim was doing, bending the evidence to fit his conclusion. Now, even if, and this is nowhere near the truth, even if every single detail checked out, there's one massive problem. The Quran explicitly denies Muhammad had this knowledge. Muhammad explicitly states, if I knew the future, I would have used it for personal gain. He's saying he doesn't know the future. I have no idea what will happen. This is not ambiguous. This is crystal clear. The Quran explicitly denies Muhammad is a soothsayer, someone who predicts the future and prophesizes events. Now, apologists point to 1149 or 72:26-27, claiming Muhammad received special knowledge. Now, this verse comes after the story of Noah. It's about past events, historical stories Muhammad's people didn't know, not future predictions. Given that 7188, 46:9, 52:29 explicitly states Muhammad did not know the future, the conclusion is clear. Muhammad was not among those chosen messengers who received future news. Say, I do not know if what is promised to you will happen soon or if my Lord will delay it for a while. He's explicitly denying knowledge of future events and plans. The Quran is explicit. Muhammad's mission is not about miracles or predictions, even in the hadith. When people use hadith prophecies as a means to prove Muhammad's prophethood, you explicitly contradict 7188, 46:9, 52:29, 17:59, and the various hadith that even say that his only miracle was the Quran. You can't have both. Either Muhammad was a fortune teller or a messenger delivering the Quran. The Quran says the latter. Traditional hadith apologists promote the former. Early Christians understood this perfectly. Syriac Christian writers noted that Muhammad performed no miracles. His only claim was the Quran's eloquence, and Muslims argued that the Quran's inimitability was the miracle. In the 8th century, Timothy states Muhammad was not a prophet because he never performed miracles. Bar Hebraeus said Muslims claim the Quran's Arabic style as their miracle, not physical signs or predictions. These weren't ignorant outsiders. They were educated Christians who lived in the Islamic world and understood Muhammad's claim rested on the Quran as revelation, not fortune telling. Now, to summarize, a video was made claiming to prove Islam through this hadith, and if the article was actually read where the diagram was found, you would discover it proves the opposite. The Quran and the hadith explicitly denies the Prophet had physical miracles. The earliest versions of these hadith are not prophetic. They go back to Abdullah. Abdullah explicitly states he got this from biblical sources. The hadith itself matches Sa'id's Basran environment. He uses Basra narrators for a Basran story about Khawarij attacking Basra. All the chains converge on Sa'id with no independent corroboration before him. The hadith explicitly says Basra, not Baghdad, and the prophecy interpretation always changes from Zanj to Turks to Mongols, and the description is just too vague because this application of broad faces and small eyes are used all over the hadith and are applied to different groups of people. And on top of this, the metin is not consistent, with various changes of the city, the bridge, animals, and physical description. This is just a classic example of retrofitting prophecies. You have a vague template that's just continuously reinterpreted throughout generations. The lesson of all of this is simply verify. Many of the claims made in the previous video was just plain out false. So don't accept claims because someone uses technical terminology or shows a diagram. Read the sources, check the context, and apply consistent standards.